How's it going, you guys? So, recently in a live stream, one of my subscribers had asked me what my book recommendations are for somebody who just wants to understand the basics of health science and nutrition science and how to be healthy, the mechanisms behind it all, and not only so that they can get a solid, grounded, realistic understanding of how to be healthy and how health works and the science behind it all, but also to prevent them from being bamboozled by misinformation, by charlatans on YouTube, even people with degrees and things, people who want to sell you supplements, or people who are just playing crazy and don't and are disconnected from reality. People who recommend things like alkaline diets and things like that. Um, if you don't understand nutrition and health science, it's very easy to be misinformed by nonsense, okay? So I already made a video listing out my recommendations for the absolute beginner. And, you know, those books that I recommended in that video, um, they're not super sciencey at all. They're not really going to help prevent you from following alkaline diets or anything, but they give you the basics you need to be healthy and for the basics you need for further research to understand what I believe are the most important aspects of health, including a lot of things that are left out from mainstream health science. So it's probably a good idea for you to go back and check out my beginner list if you haven't already, and maybe read the first book on that list. Uh, the very first book that I recommend everybody read is How the Body Works. Okay, so you could probably read any basic atlas of the human body, but I like this one because I've read it front to back and I know it has all the information you need. It's really really good for people who don't really have graduate level education. It discusses nerves, discusses muscles, digestion, um, all different parts of the human body: the retina, the eyes, spinal cord, spinal nerves, bones, ligaments. And it's the great thing about this is just pictures and explanations. The role of water. I mean, this book is just amazing. This book is absolutely amazing. I should have included this in my beginner's book, but I think most people would probably have trouble reading this book, even though it is very simple to understand. But it discusses the science and it discusses the mechanisms behind every part of your body. Now, I will say that there are some parts in there that are a little bit misinformed. Like, even if you're reading a textbook, you're still going to need to exercise skepticism and understand that not everything's absolute. For example, and it's talking about the arteries and part of the book, and it mentions that saturated fat increases cholesterol, which increases your risk of heart disease or uh, increases the likelihood of clogging the arteries or whatever. And that's not based in science. There's no causal link between saturated fats and heart disease. But again, that's up for debate, and you're fine to believe whatever you want. Again, that's the glory of textbooks, is that it gives you the basic foundational understanding of mechanisms behind how the organism works, rather than telling you, like, oh, opinions like, oh, heart disease is caused by this nutrient or that nutrient or blah blah blah. This just explains how the body works, and then you can read science, you can read clinical trials, you can read cohort studies and things like that. And based on the data from clinical trials and cohort studies, because you have a basic understanding of how the body works, these studies are going to make more sense to you now. Because you're not just like, oh, the data says, these patients developed heart disease when they ate more eggs. Now you understand, oh, LDL is a carrier of nutrients. It's a protein. It's a lipoprotein. It's not even cholesterol. And so it'll give you more perspective on how to approach studies. So how the body works is great for that. Once you read that book, um, you'll understand pretty much all nutrition books better, all physiology books better, And the glory of that book is just, it's very easy to understand, very easy to read, and it's very structured for even beginners, actually. So, next on my list is going to be Understanding Nutrition. Okay, so this book is a nutrition textbook. It's a very basic, fundamental nutrition textbook. And it does contain a whole lot of misinformation, of half-truths and propaganda, I would say. Again, that's up for debate. It is a textbook. For example, it talks about things like fiber and the necessary role of fiber, which some people find that they do better on higher fiber diets, but a lot of people find that their bowel movements actually regulate much better when they completely remove fiber. And there is science to back this up, and mechanistic data and clinical trials. But again, that's my opinion, right? That's my opinion. But this discusses what fiber does in the body, and this discusses different nutrients, essential nutrients, minerals, B vitamins, vitamin E, vitamin D, vitamin C, minerals, and protein, carbohydrates, fats. It discusses the different types of lipids, different types of fats, the different types of carbohydrates, polysaccharides, disaccharides, large peptides, small peptides. This discusses all of that. So that's very, very important. Because again, like one of the myths that people say is things like, plant protein uh, is molecularly different than animal protein because when you eat plant protein, it's just amino acids. It's easier to break down. And if you understand peptides and how protein is digested, you understand that makes no sense at all. Not to mention the fact that plant proteins aren't even broken down until they're digested by bacteria in the intestines. Long, long story. But the point here is there's a lot of nonsense out there, and this book will help you at least sort through a lot of the nonsense. Now, there is a lot of nonsense in this book, too. A lot of misinformation, but um, again, take everything with a grain of salt, even textbooks. And having an understanding of omega-6 fats, omega-9, the different types of omega-6 and omega-9, the different lengths, the different chain lengths of fatty acids and things. Um, you know, it has recommendations for different chronic diseases. Of course, it talks about the USDA food pyramid, or the My Plate, healthy eating plate. It does talk a little bit about physical activity, calories in versus calories out, energy expenditure. It talks about why fast foods are good or why fast foods are bad, why they're bad, the structure of different nutrients, a little bit of the basics of digestion, water intake, mineral balance, and I do believe it touches on pH balance as well. So, I mean, this is just the fat-soluble vitamins. Again, it doesn't actually even mention vitamin K2, which is a big complaint I have in most textbooks. You think that they would have vitamin K2 separated from vitamin K1. Unfortunately, most textbooks are incomplete. And then when you get to my more advanced book list, I'm going to talk about why this is like half of the nutrition textbook that's missing. Not that low carb diets are the be all end all, but there's a lot of science that's completely omitted from nutrition textbooks relating to ketosis that's completed with this book. Um, so yeah, it talks about fatty acid oxidation and all of that. So I mean, how different fuel sources are metabolized. This is an amazing book, and I think it should be fundamental reading for most people. So the next book I'm going to recommend directly after that is, you might call it more of a fad diet book, and that's fine, but Paleo Principles. The reason why I recommend you read both nutrition textbooks, Paleo Principles and Understanding Nutrition, is because Paleo Principles is basically exactly like Understanding Nutrition, only it discusses nutrition within a so-called Paleolithic context, which is important because they talk more about anti-nutrients. They talk about, how certain foods contain protease inhibitors, which inhibit the absorption and metabolism of protein. They contain antinutrients that can bind to minerals, and they can actually prevent minerals from being absorbed in the small intestine. It talks about food intolerances and common triggers for allergies and autoimmune diseases. And it's very easy to understand. This is like a nutrition textbook, college level, but it's laid out in a way that's easy to understand for most people. Again, I probably should have put this book in the, absolute beginner category, but it's such a big book, and it is a lot more science. I mean, it's nothing but science here. Talks about nutrient density. It does describe the essential vitamins and minerals, which you'll already understand from understanding nutrition. Um, it talks about fiber, probiotics, prebiotics, and it lays out different foods and the nutrient composition of different foods all throughout the book. It's discussing the nutrient density of different foods. It's comparing different foods. Talks about plants versus proteins. It talks about elimination diets and why certain foods might trigger autoimmune issues. Gut irritants, enzyme inhibitors, things that can damage the gut lining. Talks about leaky gut syndrome or gut permeability and how that can trigger autoimmune diseases. This book has meal plans in it. It has recommendations for people with different diseases. And I might have forgotten to mention that this book is written by a PhD nutrition scientist. Talks about the HPA axis and, which is endocrine system, different hormones and organs that secrete hormones, adrenal exhaustion and things like that. Again, has meal plans right here. There's a meal plan. It has shopping list for the meal plan. I mean, this is just an amazing book overall. It does touch on exercise and touches on, stress management and stuff like that. Nuts and seeds and some of the reasons why they may be good and why they may be bad. Lots of great information in this book. And, for people who don't want to just dive into, the more advanced understanding nutrition, this is an easier alternative. And I personally like Paleo Principles the most because one of the biggest things that is missing in mainstream nutrition textbooks are things like vitamin K2, which paleo and ancestral nutrition scientists will talk about. It discusses things like autoimmune illness and the science behind, food sensitivities, which again is something that mainstream textbooks don't talk about. Mainstream textbooks are all about calories in versus calories out. High LDL will cause heart disease, saturated fat causes heart disease, you know. And so it kind of plugs in the holes that are missing from understanding nutrition and the other textbooks that you'll read. So next on my list for intermediate readers would be this right here. So the personal fitness training handbook by National Academy of Sports Medicine. The reason why I like this book is so definitely not the nutrition advice. I would skip right through the nutrition advice, or you could read it because again, it talks about basically all the things you'll learn in understanding nutrition. Really, you could just read understanding. You could just read the NASM Fitness Handbook and Paleo Principles, and you'll learn most of what's in understanding nutrition. But basically, this book, the reason why I like it is because it teaches you the basics of exercise science, teaches you how to properly periodize a program, teaches you about progressive overload and why it's important, and why certain people, like pretty much anybody who gains muscle or strength, they're using progressive overload somehow. But most people don't know what progressive overload is, so they don't realize they're actually using progressive overload. Anybody who says progressive overload is bro science haven't actually studied progressive overload. It teaches you basic exercise form and different assessments. Teaches you about cardiovascular exercise, strength training exercise, power exercise, plyometric, jump training, speed training, agility, reactive training, and it discusses the adaptations they'll cause. It teaches you how to structure those into your program. It teaches you exercise technique, a whole chapter on exercise technique, on everything from foam rolling to stretching to basic body weight movements, cable movements, barbell squats. And it also talks about mindset and behavior change, which a lot of people have trouble with. So even if you're not actively engaging in a program yet, you will learn how to get yourself motivated to do so. So another great book that I recommend for people who are new, who are new to, health and nutrition, but have a basic, understanding, I guess, of nutrition and whatnot. Intermediates, right? I'll call it. I recommend reading the Ultramind Solution after you've read all the rest, especially after you read Paleo Principles. The main reason why I like this book, the Ultramind Solution, and why I recommend it, even though, so his nutrition, this book's from like 2003, first of all. And Dr. Mark Hyman is at the forefront of functional medicine. He's one of the very first who popularized it. I think Andrew Weil kind of started it with his complementary alternative medicine approach. But I like Mark Hyman because, so first of all, he talks about basically mainstream nutrition in this book. A high carb, whole grain, Mediterranean style diet. Because at this time, there wasn't as much science about ketosis and paleo diets and autoimmune disease. So he didn't really have access to that type of nutrition data that you'll find in Paleo Principles, for example. But at the time when he wrote this book, this book, the whole book is about mental health and the connection between nutrition and nutrients and lifestyle and mental health. This book talks about why pharmaceutical medications don't work, or why even if they work, nutrition and lifestyle will work better. It does talk about supplements. It has a protocol that you can use to test yourself, like little quizzes based on symptoms and whatnot, so that you can assess yourself and figure out what nutrient deficiencies you might have. And so then it recommends certain nutrient changes and lifestyle changes, as well as supplements that you can take to correct these ailments. And no, it doesn't recommend, any like special Mark Hyman supplement, although it might mention them. It doesn't recommend those in particular. This is entirely to help you and arm you with the knowledge that you need to reverse mental health problems using nutrition. And so, again, for an up-to-date, nutrition approach from Dr. Mark Hyman, it's probably a good idea to read his book, Food, What the Heck Do I Eat? Because that book is Mark Hyman's new book on his new updated recommendations based on the new science that he released. He released that book in 2016, which is like 15 years after he wrote this book. Actually, I think this book might have been written in 2007, so about 10 years later. Nonetheless, read this book to understand neurotransmitters, to understand the precursors, things like vitamin C, B vitamins, different amino acids and things, and how they can actually create neurotransmitters in the brain. So you can balance your neurochemistry using nutrition and supplements rather than pharmaceutical medication. So again, you're not really going to read a lot about how dopamine is created, for example, from the food you eat, from this book. But you'll read about essential vitamins and minerals and the roles in the body. You might read a little bit about how neurotransmitters are created from some parts of this book, but not really. This book is entirely dedicated to mental health and the mechanisms and health science behind nutrition and mental health. So highly recommend it. And he does actually have a free quiz that you could still download online, a free PDF that has the quizzes, so you can assess yourself and figure out what nutrients you might be deficient in, and the recommendations. And you can find that by looking at Google search Ultramind Solution Companion. And you can find a free PDF from his website and download it legally for free, without even needing to buy the book. So with that being said, these are basics for intermediates, and I think this is probably the best. Like, if you read all these books I mentioned here, you're not really going to need too much else to understand the basics of how things work. But I will be recording a video on advanced health science and nutrition science book recommendations. And those books are on clinical nutrition for dietitians, physiology and anatomy textbooks, and exercise physiology. And that's basically taking everything you heard here in this book and dialing it in to a deeper extent. And I'm also going to be talking about some of the textbooks on ketogenic diets, basically. Um, so leave your question in the comments down below. Let me know if you have any recommendations. Let me know what you think about this list. And if you've read any of these books, let me know down in the comments. Or if you've read a book similar to this, okay? Also, let me know what is your top 5 intermediate nutrition science and health books. And I'll talk to you all very soon.